Welcome to the Specter of Capitalism. We'll let the experts introduce themselves, starting at the far end.
Okay, I'm Luke Peterson. I'm a professor of political science at Utah Valley University, and I run an office there called the Office of New Urban Mechanics, where we do civic innovation. And I also run a writing contest and workshop called Futurescapes, and I have experienced capitalism before.
Have you experienced other things?
Sure.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So that's a great resume.
Thanks.
My name is Eric Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State University. I do primarily history of science, history of technology, military history. I do some dabble in world history, American history. I'm also a science fiction writer. My biggest claim to fame is a novel on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Won the Sidewise Award 9 years ago for the best alternate history of the year.
So just started reading that because I'm on the panel with you tomorrow for the Cuban.
Well, you better find out how it is.
It is alternate history, so you may want to get to the end of that one. Okay, so reading the description out of the thing here, Westerners are well known for fearing communist takeover of their society. What did the specter of capitalism look like from inside the borders of communist countries? So let's start with that, and I think we're going to diverge fairly quickly off of that. Anybody have experience with that?
Personal experience?
Or documentary experience that you can reference?
Have we traveled to communist countries before?
Not while they were communist.
Yeah, I have.
I have. That's true. I've been to China.
Yeah, I've been to China. Which
Tell us about it.
China is a fascinating place. So I went there about 10 years ago, and very vigorous. So let me back up for a moment. We need to distinguish between capitalism, socialism, and communism. Okay, and the way I'm going to distinguish it is capitalism can be variety, is used as a swear word in many ways or as a positive word in many ways, but it basically means private ownership of the means of production predominantly, and the rule of law dictating economic relationships. At its best, that's capitalism. Socialism is higher rates of taxation in order to provide more social services for the population. Socialism, at its best, is happening under a true democracy, a democratic government. And oftentimes, one of the things that happens with socialism is many of the major industries are nationalized and controlled by the government. Communism is an acknowledgement that people don't always like being socialists, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a dictatorship, and the dictatorship is going to make everyone be good communists. And there is no, communism by definition is a dictatorship run by the party where there is no private property ownership by and large. Everything is owned by the state, and everything in the economy is centrally planned, as opposed to the planning emerging from many decisions within a capitalist system merging together into how the economy functions. China is communist only in name. In 1978, several years after the death of Mao Zedong, a person by the name of Deng Xiaoping took over and basically said, you know what? China used to be great. China, throughout almost all of world history, China was the biggest economy in the world. And in fact, China stopped being the biggest economy in the world in the 1880s when the United States surpassed it. We want to return to that, and so what we're going to do is we are going to practice communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics. And what they did is they started to small segments of the economy, they started to allow capitalism to come. You know where most of the capitalism came from? The Taiwanese. It was the Taiwanese coming in to these free economic zones, building factories, And China, which had enormous potential, started to grow at 10% growth rates and sustain those growth rates for many years. And China's went some extraordinary places. But what China basically is it's returned to being what it was before the communist revolution. It's an oligarchy in which the elite run the country for their purposes.
So
Yes.
basically, China hasn't really been communist since like the late 70s.
It's become less and less communist as time's gone by. Now, it's weird because they still will teach communism in the school, and what it is they're complete hypocrites about it. But what they do believe, more than anything else, is there can be only one government. There can be only one source of authority. And anything that smacks of a separate source of authority that's not controlled by the government will be actively suppressed, whether that be a corporation or the rule of law, which they do not have, or religions, or any other mass organization. They are, as all true dictatorships, they're absolutely terrified of being overthrown tomorrow.
I was just going to add to that. By the 90s, they were referring to it as free market socialism, whatever that means, right? So there was that period of liberalization starting with Deng Xiaoping, and the free market zones, which you mentioned, right? Kind of going, all right, we're going to try and contain it into, we'll put it here and here, and this is where market's going to occur and so forth. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that Deng Xiaoping comes after Mao, who was sort of the crazy radical, did terrible things, lots of people died. And then the Soviet Union kind of has the opposite story, where Lenin, towards the end, was thinking more about liberalizing the economy, and reintroducing elements of free market. And then Stalin's the guy who comes in and he goes, no, we don't need entrepreneurship in order to give people an incentive. We just need fear to give people an incentive, right?
Did Trotsky play into that? Was he kind of similar to Stalin?
No, he left because survival. There's a reason why Trotsky was killed in Mexico City in 1940 by an assassin sent by Stalin.
Yeah.
Watch out for ice picks.
I think, John, if I can just make just a quick comment and then I'll shut up about you guys. But when I got through, what was funny to me is you're on the bus and I pass a KFC, I pass a McDonald's. There's a Starbucks in the Forbidden City. And I'm like, who owns it? Who makes money off this? They're like, these belong to the people.
Okay. No. Okay, so
In the Forbidden City?
Yeah.
yeah. So
Inside the wall.
let me tell you two stories about China.
is there.
One is they still don't have private ownership of land, but they do have 99-year leases. And they do have, there's lots, businesses can be privately owned. So I went and saw Mao himself, because the mausoleum for Mao is in Tiananmen Square, right in front of the entrance to the Forbidden City. And it was fascinating because we go there and there's crowds. I mean, this enormous crowd that's waiting to go in the mausoleum. And we're like the three Westerners there. And these people came over and says, come with us. And we come with them, and there's a place we could store our bags. And we're like, we'll get our bags back. And then they took us to the front of the line. And you're going like, oh yes, white privilege wins again. Actually, China
Capitalist privilege.
are not, it is not socially unacceptable to crowd in line in China. And I remember as I was watching this, there was this little old lady, and she had her family in tow, and she was like a freaking icebreaker going through that crowd. And that was entirely acceptable social behavior. But so you come up there and you can spend a small amount of money and you can buy some silk flowers. And then you can go in and you go into the mausoleum, and it's this big black monolithic building. And you go in, and the first thing you see is this massive statue of Mao. And people would come up and they would bow and they would give him the offering of the flower. And then as they were taking you around the edge, I noticed that people were collecting up all the flowers and taking them back out and putting them in the bin to sell them to the next people. And then
Capitalism.
That is some great recycling going on.
yeah, and then you go in, and the next room, there he is, this enormous thing called Mao, and I'll tell you why it's enormous, who is in this glass box. And I've never understood the word adultery until I watched the Chinese people walking past Mao.
He's like Mickey Mouse over there.
Well,
Everything.
no, no. He is, well, Mickey Mouse though is a cartoon. I mean, he is. So what's amazing is now the reason he's all bloated is because when he died, the Chinese are suddenly like, hey, we should keep him. We have no idea how to embalm someone. And so they went and just jammed him full of formaldehyde, and he went. And so even though they had no good relationships with the Soviets, they said, could you send some experts over so we can like shrink him a little and display him like you have Lenin and Stalin displayed, and Stalin used to be displayed. And so now the final thing is, then you go into the next room, and the next room is a large room that's filled with shops selling you Mao memorabilia. Little red book, I saw Mao, all this sort of stuff. And then you go out the back, and they've cordoned off the equivalent of a city block of Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is really big. And then there's all the privately run shops, and you run this gauntlet of touts and people trying to. So here it is, the most sacred communist Chinese experience you can have that's been completely commercialized at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And that is, it takes so long to tell that story because it really represents so much of what China is and the contradictions that is China today.
And it's been that's been an evolution, right? Like I have a watch. I was trying to find it so I could wear it for this panel. But I have a watch that's a waving Deng Xiaoping watch, right? But I got that in high school in Hong Kong.
Okay.
And at the time, it was like, don't go into China with this thing because you'll be in serious trouble, right? So at that point, they were still kind of just beginning to kind of go, all right, we can sell knickknacks that have Mao, and they had Mao waving watches too, right?
Go to any Chinatown anywhere around the Pacific Rim, and what you see is a hotbed of entrepreneurial energy.
Yeah.
And what China finally did when they broke away from communism is they brought that back. And China is really amazing that way, but they do have this dictatorship that maintains absolute control. And if you look at other communist countries that we've had before suddenly they all went away, you had Soviet Union, you had Eastern Europe. Basically, you had all the places that had been conquered by the Red Army. And every one of them had to restrict civil rights and restrict opportunities because they needed to control their populations. And they were also very good at killing a lot of their population. During the 20th century, about 100 million people are dead as a direct cause of communism. Now, over half of that is famine from introducing collectivization of agriculture in China, well, in Russia and Ukraine. And then later, in China, it was a famine that partially was attributed to collectivization and partially is because Mao decided he wanted to be the world's #1 iron producer, so he had everyone build iron forges in their backyard and make
Instead of
pig
farm.
iron. Yeah. What's that?
Instead of farm.
Instead of
grow
farm.
food to eat.
And it's called the Great Leap Forward, and the best estimate, about 40 million people starved to death.
Yeah, really terrible.
So,
Do we have equivalent numbers for capitalist countries?
well,
Or do we not research that?
Okay, well, first of all, capitalism is a much more amorphous thing. So I would think if you want to go with capitalism, you could talk about slavery, which is understandable, though I should point out slavery has been a characteristic of world history since the beginning. And what should be amazing about slavery isn't that slavery exploited people, but that we stopped. Because that's the true extraordinary example of progress.
At least legal slavery.
I agree. There are other forms of exploitation and coercion in that. The worst story of capitalism is called a book called King Leopold's Ghost, and it's about the Belgian Congo and the exploitation by the Belgians of the Congolese. Probably 5 to 7 million people died within about a 15-year period. Many of them in very horrible ways, as the King of Belgium tried to exploit his personal fiefdom. It was actually not a colony of Belgium, it was his personal colony. And to force the population to extract rubber from trees, back when natural rubber was the only way that you could get rubber and cars were becoming a thing.
I'd like to address the Specter of Capitalism thing. I don't know if you were headed there next, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What I would like, just as a programming note, what I would like to do is ask you a question and then sit back and listen for the rest of the hour.
sounds fantastic.
So please.
And do it.
So the idea of this, and I thought it was interesting because I haven't seen a lot about it, is, obviously we see movies, we know about the Red Scare, we know about how Americans freaked out about communists in our midst. My great uncle was blacklisted, right? I mean, he was blacklisted because not because he was a communist, but because he was having a fight with his wife, and he was serving with the Marshall Plan in Korea, and his wife, in order to get back at him, joined the Communist Party.
Oh, golly.
And
That's a pretty darn effective way to get back at him
Yeah.
in the early 50s.
He got
late 40s.
got sent right back home, and instead of, this is a guy who helped with the liberation, one of the first people into some of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and then he was blacklisted and managed an apartment complex in San Diego for the rest of his life. So that's kind of what the Specter of Communism looked like, right? Capitalism is a little bit different, and I think part of the reason why we know so much about fear of communism is because we're in a pluralistic republic where people can be communist, right? We're in a society where you can belong to different parties and you can voice controversial views. Yeah, well, yeah, with some exceptions. But in a more authoritarian communist state, that wasn't so much of an option. The state definitely communicated certain things about what to fear about capitalism. So the main idea was that America in particular was a place controlled from Wall Street, that it was chaotic and unstable, and it was chaotic and unstable.
Was that just Soviet, or was that also Chinese?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea being that
And North Korean and.
yeah, but the idea being that these are unstable countries, they're imperialistic, and that they will force their view of the world on the rest of the world at gunpoint, right? And this is where you get the idea of gun barrel democracy. And it's not without validity, right? If we go and look at our history of interactions in Southeast Asia, South America, Central America, etc. But that's what a lot of the push was, and that was kind of the narrative, especially in Stalinist Soviet Union, Maoist China. Interestingly, in the late 60s and into the 70s, the Soviet Union set up an institute, it was the USA Institute, and they actually tried to study the United States and understand it, and go for less of a caricature and more try to fill in the blanks on what exactly was bad about this capitalist society. And it was kind of controversial because they weren't always critical. Their findings weren't always super critical of the United States, but
Unacceptable.
Yeah, but they would make visits to the United States, and they would sort of study us and kind of make a more elaborate case. At the same time, during the 70s, the Communist Party, just like we were talking about with China, the Communist Party in a lot of ways was promoting the principles of capitalism without calling them capitalism. They're trying to figure out how to make people, find greater incentives to be more productive and more individualistic, and things that they had been telling their people for a long time were bad and associated with capitalism. So all of that, there's a definite portrayal of what America was about and capitalism was about and why it was bad, but it doesn't have a popular culture element to it the way the Red Scare does, because there's really just the one voice about it. It's the state telling you how to think about capitalism, rather than a bunch of different voices like we had here, where Hollywood and Congress and people in the government and professors, heaven help us, crazy liberal professors, right? We're all
Or the free press.
or the press, right? All the dangerous
Fake
elements
news.
that you had to watch out for here in the United States.
When it came to propaganda, was there any kind of popular element in like the Soviet Union, or was it pretty much all top down?
Yeah.
Whereas in the Western it was mainly bottom up, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so it's state controlled, right? Everything's state controlled. There are people smuggling in goods from the West, and there is black markets going on. There is all that sort of thing. There are people who like capitalism and all of that. But as far as the narrative put forward by the state, at least until we start to get to the late 70s, 80s, 90s, is just state generated. This is what capitalism is. This is why it's bad.
I agree.
How effective was the Soviet or Chinese propaganda? Did a large portion of the population believe it, or was it more like, yeah, okay, we get it, can we go home now?
Well,
Will they not kill us or throw us into the camp?
without alternative narratives,
Right.
Yeah.
it's what they had to believe in. Whether or not they believed in the government, well, they had learned not to believe in the government. But if the government was effective in cutting off transmissions, one of the things that happened after World War II is the United States created something called Radio Free Europe. And this was transmissions that were basically like American news being broadcast into communist countries. Those communist countries went out of their way to make sure that those transmissions were jammed, because as a dictatorship, they understood the key was restricting the flow of information. And they did that. One of the things that happened towards the end, which was really bizarre, is that East Germany had a very difficult time blocking stuff, and things would bleed over, and so people would watch Dallas. the soap Dallas on West German television.
Yeah.
And for a strict socialist, they're like, look at the excesses. Whereas for an East German, they're like, look at all those goods. I mean,
Stuff they got.
and there was a reason why you had defections regularly happening from the communist countries to the West. And while it did happen the other way, it was much, much less frequent. And a person had to be really ideologically committed. Whereas the other ones are just like, man, life is so much better over here. And part of it is because we had economies that really flourished in a way that didn't happen otherwise. And coming back to China, China's government's number one rationale for them having the right to be in charge is they have made the economy flourish. And that has been a very true story ever since 1978. And it is to their credit. Of course, have they made enormous environmental
Costs? Yeah.
costs? Absolutely. Oh, and the environmental costs in the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and we started to examine what had happened to the Soviet Union, people who think capitalism is what's destructing the economy have never looked at communism, because
So I think there's an interesting element to the.
removed mountaintops that would argue with you.
There's an interesting element to the China story too, where you're absolutely right. It's they're justifying their existence on the fact that they're flourishing. But if you go and look from Mao's time forward, they also are actually not. They're speaking in a whole other language too. A lot of what they're communicating is in terms of traditional Chinese thought about what makes a regime legitimate. There was the idea that a dynasty is born and it has a spring and it has a summer when it flourishes, and eventually it has a fall, and then it's time for a new dynasty, and that's when you get overthrown. And so the key, if you were trying to keep a hold of your dynasty, was show that you're flourishing, show that it's still summer. And that's what China is constantly doing when they're manipulating their numbers, when they're messing with their currency, right? It isn't actually so much just about communism or capitalism. For China, it goes to hundreds, thousands of years of tradition in terms of how they think about government legitimacy, right?
It's kind of ironic, right? Because they were trying to get away from, the traditions of the past.
Mao was very focused on destroying the past,
Okay.
right? Erase it.
there are people that believe. So I have a Chinese colleague at Weber State, and I remember talking to him once, and he is a nationalist. He is a nationalist with the little n, not a big N.
Yeah.
Big N means you fled to Taiwan. Little n means you believe whatever your government says, and he swallows it. I remember he said, China has never engaged in an aggressive war in its history. And I'm looking at him going like, wow,
Okay.
you are really ignorant. And you should probably ask every country around China if China's ever engaged in an aggressive war in their history. But China's history oscillates. If you look at it, what China does is it creates a centralized government, and then the centralized government collapses into warlordism, and then one faction wins, and it becomes a centralized government, and it collapses back. And when the communists came to power, the country had descended into warlordism, and the Communist Party brought back centralized government. This is 1949.
The Chinese Civil War, how many major factions were? I know there was the communists, the nationalists, I guess the Japanese sympathizers.
By and large, there were only two factions. But the nationalist faction was by and large a coalition of warlords, and that weakened it. And the communist faction, and it really helped that in the end, the Red Army fed an enormous amount of weapons and territory into the communist faction, and that's why they won the Civil War.
Mao also had one of the most brilliant strategies ever, where he marched his army all over the country, and he was chased, right, by the nationalists, the Long March. And as he would go into a village, he would go, "All right, I'm going to redistribute the land. I'm going to take it from the corrupt people who control your village. I'm going to give it to everybody. I'm going to let people out of prison. I'm going to make this a just society." He'd leave town, nationalists come back in, set everything back the way it was before, and pretty soon his numbers just kept growing and growing. People would go, "I want to go find that Mao guy. I like the way he did things," right?
Well, the peasants had been beaten up all throughout history, and there was that rationale. And the other thing is socially, he was a peasant. He was a rich peasant, came from a rich peasant family. They always forget that part.
Right, yeah.
But socially, he was a peasant, and there was appeal in that way. And the nationalist forces came very close to winning, but there were a variety of things that got in their way. And the biggest thing was, to get into a detail, Japan controlled Manchuria for years, and Japan lost Manchuria in basically the week after Hiroshima to the end of the war, the 2 weeks. And all those weapons that were captured, those Japanese weapons, then were turned over to the communists by the Red Army, and Manchuria was turned over to them. This is a big hunk of the country. This is a substantial hunk of the country that really gave the communists an edge up it still took 4 years of civil war to win. But and the Americans did help the nationalists, but the nationalists were actually socialists. But they also had a lot of corrupt allies, and they
Weren't liked.
yeah, and they all the bad things of the past were associated with nationalism. All the hopes of the future were associated with the communists, and that helped ideologically to win the hearts and minds.
They had reached their fall. Communists seemed like they'd reached spring.
Yep.
So, quick question for the audience: is there anyone here who's curious more about the daily experience of individual people, or is this conversation more about nations and large flow more what you're interested in? Okay, just
Okay.
carry on.
Okay.
So, what country, when, what time period? I mean, honestly, because
Yeah.
it's so widely
Yeah.
variable.
Well, and it seems like, and here's part of the problem, right? Because I sit over here and make sniping comments.
We ignore him.
Yeah, you guys can't hear it because I'm over here just
Yep.
whispering.
I was trying to remember a few of them because I wanted to react to them, but then I forgot to.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But because I think that from a broader social standpoint, right? And we talk about the propaganda and the idea that
Yeah.
you only have one source of information, therefore
Yeah.
there's only one experienced truth
Right.
because you have no other
Yeah.
dream or vision to compare it with.
Yeah.
Down in a little bit more of the pragmatic day to day, to some degree, and unfortunately I never lived in a communist country while it was actually fully communist. I've only been there soon after it became the hybrid version of like China.
Which was a very chaotic period.
Yeah.
But having lived a year in West Berlin, back when there was still a wall around it, and all the people like to laugh about the East German TV broadcast tower, which is a large bronze dome atop a tower, that because sunlight does what sunlight does, always had a cross on it. And it was referred to as the Pope's Revenge by the Westerners. The Easterners, who at that time at least were allowed to come over, how old are you? Being free, being fair, the old Easterners were allowed to come over to the West and then not let back in to the East.
Hey,
That's
that's
how they
good.
got-
That's a good way to
That
move
was
your
their Social Security program.
expenses.
Is they shipped you to the West and let them take care of it.
Yeah.
But what was really intriguing is I got a chance to talk to a lot of those people while I was there, and they would say things partly from indoctrination, but partly they had experienced the West and knew
Yeah.
something of it. And they would say things like, "Well, yeah, you can buy anything you want to at the store, but I could walk the streets at midnight and be safe."
We might want to point out that East Germany was the most prosperous communist country,
Yeah.
Right?
and it's because they're Germans.
Well, and that's a key thing, right? Because just speaking from my own experience, one thing
compared to
that
all
we
the other
knew-
countries, they were the most prosperous.
Yeah, because one of the things that we knew,
Yeah.
as I always considered myself German, even though I wasn't, but was we always knew that being German was more important than being East or West, and that this division
Yeah.
would pass because Germanness was always more powerful than any ism.
Well, and I think there are some great points here, right? Like, we still, I feel like we've done it to a certain extent in this panel because it's easy to paint communism as just all bad.
Have
right?
you ever seen, by the way, a sunny day depiction of East Berlin? Short answer in the Western press, no.
No,
It's
yeah,
always
yeah.
a cloudy day.
But the
We
interest.
propagandize too.
But there's truth, right, to what you're saying. I mean, and it can be true of a lot of authoritarian states, regardless of whether or not they're communist or whatever. China's a safe place, right? You're much less likely to get shot there than you are here.
It
right?
is, unless you're a Uyghur.
Right.
Well, sure, or unless you like breathing for an extended period of time.
But but if we're gonna just
Having gotten Beijing lung syndrome, yeah.
And I think there's also there's a compelling argument to be made that in some ways China's hybrid model, whatever it is working, right? I mean, people said you can't have the internet if you want to be a closed society. They walled off their internet and they found a way to make it work, right? They said if you want capitalism, then you have to, accept all that comes with that and get rid of central planning. They said, no, we don't. That's stupid. Then it would just be the market going wherever random customers want it. We want to go specific places. So they still have their 5-year plans, and they can say, we want to be the best in laser technology. And they did that a while ago. And then, within a couple of years, they were, right? Because they centrally planned and said, we'll invest the hell out of that and make it happen.
And that's part of the interesting thing about it, right? Because especially in this hybrid model that we're seeing now, both in the former Soviet Union and in China, not so much in North Korea, we're seeing more of that trickle down, as it were. I hate to use that term because I don't like it. But anyway, usually what trickles downhill is something a little more organic. But it can work with central resource distribution, and when it's done well, is anyone here, let me rephrase this. Is everyone here familiar with LDS theology, at least at a basic level? Okay, so when I say, if only kings could be righteous, if all kings could be righteous, monarchies, despotisms, however you want to phrase it, would be the most efficient means of government.
If you read Leonard J. Arrington's history of Utah, his economic history of Utah, the Great Basin Kingdom,
which I have,
that's a great book, and it's this wonderful example of seeing central planning work.
Okay. Yes, if your goal is a stable society, if your goal is a society that innovates, central planning, by its nature, doesn't like innovation because it distorts the planning process.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I am much more interested in building a great high-tech civilization. And someone's got to be out there doing the innovating. And a society that, there's a reason why the amount of technological innovations out of Europe drop through the floor once Europe moved to more socialist models. Because socialist models want stability. They don't want industries overthrown by technological change. Now, that being said, I do believe that you talked about how China's doing a hybrid model. Every country in this world is actually doing a hybrid model. There is no purely capitalist country in this world or purely libertarian country.
And China would argue they're better at it than the rest of us.
You know why? Because China's been playing catch up. Wait till they have to be at the forefront of innovation. Then they're going to find out that their system doesn't work nearly as well.
But that is why I gave that example of lasers, for example, right? I mean, they did catch up, and now they lead.
They caught up because they knew how to get to that point.
Yeah.
It's easy to catch up when you have examples around you and technology that you can steal to allow you to catch up.
Yeah.
When you don't have any examples or any technology to steal, now you have to have innovation, create something, and the entire social structure that China has had in the past, and I believe has in the present, is an impediment to them allowing innovation. Because innovation causes creative destruction. Mm-hmm. People hate creative destruction.
And that goes back to one of the main critiques of capitalism that you would hear if you were in the Soviet Union, right? That it's unstable, it's chaotic, it's dangerous, right?
And the Soviet Union, as it grew, it was growing because it was stealing and importing Western technology. It was still playing catch up. It's easier to competently run a country and play catch up than it is to be the leader and try to innovate towards the future.
I think that's a safe assessment.
That's fair. It's just the idea that capitalistic societies are somehow free of any sin just drives me nuts.
That is definitely, if anybody got that, That is not what we're
No,
saying.
no.
Yeah.
You notice that my definition of capitalism was very specific to emphasize the positive aspects of capitalism. One of the biggest problems we have with capitalism is it doesn't correctly evaluate the costs and the advantages of public goods.
Right.
Which means, so you want to build a factory there to mine that and make that object. Well, that's cool, and you'll make a profit. Okay, who cleans up the mess afterwards? And in America, by and large, we have private profit,
Government for that.
public cleanup.
Yeah.
And so, look at mines.
You broke it, you bought it only works when somebody else is in control,
Right.
not an environmental.
Yeah, we call those social and environmental costs that they don't have to put on their ledger externalities, right? We decide to treat them as external to the company, right? And so
Thus
it's just not
irrelevant.
irrelevant, right? We don't have to worry about it.
And we really need to do better at that. And so, if I may get on my soapbox, because I haven't been on one yet. You're supposed to laugh. Global warming is the biggest issue that this world faces right now. Global warming is going to be solved by technology. You need an innovative society to create that technology. If you don't, we'll just toast. And I mean that in a very literal way.
Some might argue that innovative society created the problem. But anyway,
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how we
if
got
you
here.
broke
damn
it, you bought it.
The only thing to fix it
There is an original
innovation.
sin. To murder
We're
and
past
get
it.
gain.
Is okay.
Is it-
As long as they're good victims. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I'm going to wait for the lightning
I was
bolt.
talking to someone about this issue, and they said, "Oh, well, I don't think that we should have. I think that the free market would be able to solve global warming. Just let." I'm like, I don't think
that's not what
businesses in
happens.
particular. It's not their aim to like be environmentally clean. Their aim
It's a
is to
collective
like-
action problem.
Actually, free market always is subject to the social and political conditions that it operates in. If we change that, for instance, one of the best solutions for global warming to slow it down is carbon trading. And carbon trading, or sometimes called the carbon tax, is a brilliant use of free market principles to drive down carbon creation. The problem is it requires government regulation. So the right's like, oh, it's not in our toolbox. And the left, you're using the market. No, it's not in our toolbox. You need the toolbox from both factions to get together and compromise, and that is what will lead us towards the future. The left and the right, in its most extreme, are caricatures of actual solutions. For instance, we just had the Green New Deal announced, which actually had only something to do with global warming. Mostly it had to do with left-wing fantasies about the world they want to create. And one of the things that they explicitly excluded from it was nuclear power, which is one of the most important solutions to moving forward to solving global warming.
Is it one of the cleanest?
As an avowed lefty who loves nuclear power, let me say, as a transition technology, we need to be pragmatic about it.
That's right.
And understand that it's a necessary evil if. So I happen to disagree with the left on that one, even though I'm a radical leftist. So
Yeah, I'm good with it as long as you don't put it in seismically active areas.
if we have proper regulation,
Guess what,
anything
typhoon's gonna
can be
hit.
said.
Okay, why don't we suggest a fact? Not a single person in America has ever died from domestic nuclear power use.
Whoa!
Period. Domestic nuclear power use.
Okay, well, while we're in fantasy land, I'd like a unicorn too.
No, it's not. And where are you going to go? Because you're already in fantasy land if that's not a truth. That is a true statement. Name who died. What incident did it happen in? Certainly wasn't 3 Mile Island, in which all the safety measures actually worked correctly.
What about
Zero
all the
people died.
miners mining uranium who died of radiation
Most of-
poisoning? What about all of the other people involved in the production of nuclear?
Okay, almost all that was
Power.
for weapons. No, most
According
of that
to
was for
you,
weapons.
that is not a fact. So that's part of the thing, right? Is
Okay.
we have a perspective, and here's the
Okay.
thing: there is
It's
destruction.
2019. We don't worry about facts anymore. So it's just-
Oh! Okay.
I have alternative facts that I would like to offer. Now, and that's the thing, is you talk about industrial accidents, and that's absolutely fair. Now, we've killed a whole lot of people with black lung. We've killed a whole lot of people with radiation overdoses. We've also
Silicosis.
killed a whole lot of them with direct application of
Our-
nuclear weapons, right?
Our air quality here in
Only nation
Utah
on Earth,
kills
by the way, to
people
ever
every
use a nuclear
year.
weapon.
But we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Oh, yeah.
But
Why
it-
would we
it
put a
does
steel mill in an inversion zone?
Okay.
Oh, for military purposes, because we wanted to have an inland, safe steel production facility during World War II.
By the way, I hate the inversion. I hate the pollution in Utah. You have never seen pollution until you go to China.
Yes.
I mean, we are talking on a level that you're going like, the air's crunchy.
I
And
literally.
that is not an exaggeration.
I grew up in Hong Kong. The pollution gave me asthma.
Yeah.
I came to the United States. My asthma went away.
And
I was
Hong
in
Kong is
Beijing
one
in
of the cleaner
2007.
places because it has sea breezes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in the Chicago area where we were really lucky because the wind patterns took all of our pollution and dumped it on Detroit. So we didn't care.
Well, then are we just kind of unlucky
They're-
that
they're-
some of these steel reserves happen to be in places like an inversion valley? Or iron, I guess.
Yeah.
Steel.
You know, people like to live in valleys, like we do here. Anyway,
Especially
he's-
in
And I hate to be a troll, but our time has passed. The conversation's interesting. Please grab people in the hallways and continue. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.